When Sheriff Will Anderson helped a young drifter, Eli Monroe, avoid a hefty railroad fine, he never imagined that small act of kindness would come back to haunt him. Years later, Eli had become a powerful rancher, slowly suffocating the town under his growing empire, betraying the very people who had helped him rise. But a final, fierce confrontation between the two men ignited a shift that no one could have predicted. And as the dust settled, justice was finally served, proving that redemption isn't just a second chance, it's a choice. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Fort Kavanaugh, a lonely, windswept town where the sun only seemed to shine when it was about to set. For Sheriff Will Anderson, the years of service had worn him thin, his boots scuffed, his shoulders heavy, and his heart burdened by the weight of 1,000 decisions made in the name of justice. He was nearing the end of his long career, and the town had begun to change around him. Folks weren't as neighborly as they used to be. The faces in the crowd grew more hardened, more indifferent. It was on a cold, gray evening in early winter, when the last of the light was fading from the sky, that a stranger appeared on the horizon. A lone rider, his coat tattered, his face weathered by the elements, pulled his horse into the town's dusty square. His name was Eli Monroe. Will had seen many like him, drifters, wanderers, men and women searching for something, whether it was work, food, or simply a place to rest. But Eli was different. His eyes held a quiet desperation, the kind you couldn't fake. He wasn't just passing through, he was running out of options. As Eli made his way to the town's railroad station, a sharp-eyed deputy spotted him, a stranger, unregistered and moving without care. There was something about the way Eli walked, his head low as if trying to avoid notice, that set the deputy's nerves on edge. But the law was the law, and the rules were clear. Anyone caught not paying their railroad fines would face the consequences. When Will was called to the station, he found Eli sitting in a dusty corner, his hands nervously rubbing together. His worn boots shifted uneasily as he looked up at the sheriff, who stood tall with the weight of his badge and the years on his shoulders. "You've been caught riding the rail without paying, son," Will said, his voice steady, though not unkind. "That'll be a fine. I'm afraid there's no way around it." Eli looked down at the ground, shame and frustration written across his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. His eyes flickered with something deeper, something more desperate. "I don't have the money," Eli finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to get caught. I'm just trying to get to Kansas City. Need to keep moving. I don't mean any harm." Will studied him for a moment. It wasn't just the man's words, it was his whole posture, the defeat in his eyes, the exhaustion in his shoulders, that told Will more than any confession ever could. This was no hardened criminal. This was a man caught in a rough world, trying to keep his head above water. The sheriff took a step forward, his boots creaking in the silence of the small room. Without a second thought, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handful of cash, counted it quickly, and handed it to the deputy. "Let him go," Will said, his voice firm but calm. "I'll pay his fine." The deputy blinked, taken aback. "Sheriff, you sure about that? This man broke the law." Will didn't flinch. "I'm sure." He turned his gaze back to Eli, who still sat with his head lowered, too embarrassed to meet the sheriff's eyes. Will placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple, kind gesture that spoke volumes. "You're lucky, son. Life's hard, and sometimes the law ain't the answer to everything. You'll get out of here with a lesson learned, and one day you'll have the chance to do the same for someone else. When that time comes, don't forget the kindness you were shown." Eli's eyes met his then, wide, unsure, and full of gratitude. "I don't know how to repay this, Sheriff. I don't even know what to say." Will gave him a quiet smile, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "Don't worry about it. Just promise me you won't forget. Pay it forward when you can. That's all I ask." For a moment, Eli simply nodded. He wanted to say something more, but the words felt too small compared to the kindness Will had shown him. The sheriff turned and walked out of the station, leaving Eli alone with his thoughts. As the door swung shut behind him, Eli looked down at the money still clutched in his hands, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Will hadn't solved all his problems, but for that brief moment, he had given Eli the one thing that mattered most: a chance. The years had moved like the steady roll of the seasons in Fort Kavanaugh. Sheriff Will Anderson, now in the twilight of his career, had seen much, and yet there was a quiet feeling gnawing at him, a sensation that things weren't quite as they used to be. The town, once close-knit and neighborly, had grown colder. People were more guarded, their smiles more forced. The days had grown long, and the faces of the townsfolk more familiar, but less genuine. Retirement was something Will had been waiting for, but as he handed over his badge to the younger deputy, he couldn't shake the sense of disappointment. He'd always tried to do right by the law, by the people of the town. Yet, as the sun dipped low on his final days in uniform, Will couldn't help but wonder, had it all really made a difference? One crisp morning, as Will walked through the town square, wrapped in a coat worn soft with years of service, something caught his eye, a sight that caused his heart to skip a beat. A massive herd of cattle, at least 1,000 strong, was being driven through the square. The sound of hooves hitting the dirt rang out in a thunderous chorus as cowboys and hands moved to manage the herd. But it wasn't the cattle that froze Will in his tracks. It was the man at the front of the herd, the man guiding them with calm authority, his eyes scanning the horizon like someone who had seen the hard truth of life but come out stronger for it. Will's heart skipped. It was Eli Monroe, the drifter he had once helped so many years ago, the man who had barely been able to scrape together a penny to pay his railroad fine. Will had expected nothing from him. It was a kindness given freely, without thought of return. But here, before him, was a man who had made something of himself, a prosperous rancher, leading a vast herd with a surety Will had never imagined he'd see in the young traveler. For a moment Will stood there, stunned, his mind racing to piece together the years. Eli Monroe, the same man he'd helped, the one who had promised to pay it forward. "Eli?" Will called out, his voice cracking with both surprise and confusion. His mind was working overtime, trying to understand how this had happened, how the drifter who'd had nothing had come to lead a thriving ranching operation. But the question hung in the air: what had Eli done to get here? Eli looked up, meeting Will's gaze across the bustling square. His face, now weathered by time and experience, broke into a warm smile. There was a familiarity in his eyes, but also something more, something that spoke of respect, of gratitude, and perhaps even a little bit of pride. "Well, if it isn't Sheriff Will Anderson," Eli said, his voice strong but friendly, the years of hardship softened by the success he now wore like armor. "It's been a long time." Will felt a sudden rush of emotions, a mix of surprise and nostalgia, but also a lingering question he couldn't shake. You're the one who made all this happen?" Will gestured to the herd, to the men working the cattle, to the land stretching out in every direction. How did you come so far?" Eli nodded slowly, his gaze shifting for a moment, as though looking at a memory only he could see. Then he looked back at Will, his smile fading into something more serious, but no less sincere. "I've paid my debts, Sheriff," he said, his words steady and full of meaning. "You gave me a chance when no one else would, and I never forgot." Will's chest tightened. He had never expected repayment, had never even thought about it. To him, it had been a simple act of kindness, something he hoped would be passed along someday. But here it was, standing before him, the manifestation of his faith in one person. I didn't expect this," Will said quietly, his voice tinged with awe. "I just wanted to give you a chance. That was all." "I know," Eli replied, "but it's more than that. You showed me what it meant to have a chance, and for that, I'm forever grateful." There was a long pause as the weight of their words hung in the air. Will looked around at the bustling scene in front of him, the ranchers, the workers, the animals. He saw something different now, a ripple of change, the result of a single act of kindness years ago. "And what about you?" Will asked, taking a step closer. "What will you do with all of this?" Eli's gaze softened as he looked back at the herd, then met Will's eyes once more. I've been paying it forward ever since, Eli said with quiet certainty. Every day, every cattle sold, every hand I hired, it's all part of the debt I still owe. And just like that, Will realized something profound. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness had the most profound consequences. He had done nothing more than show mercy, and in return Eli had built a legacy, not just of wealth, but of a life lived with purpose, grounded in the very same values Will had hoped to impart. Will gave him a smile, one full of pride, though unspoken. The sheriff might have been retiring from his post, but today, in this moment, he understood something far greater than the law, that the true meaning of justice sometimes had little to do with rules and everything to do with the quiet, unseen moments of grace. Well, Will said, his voice soft but filled with satisfaction, it looks like you've done more than pay your debts, Eli. You've made something worth having. Eli nodded, his face serious now, but still full of gratitude. I hope I've made you proud, Sheriff. Will didn't need to say another word. The weight of his career had just been lifted in that simple exchange, because it wasn't about the law, it was about people, and Will had done something that had truly mattered. As Eli led his herd through the town, Will watched in silence, a quiet smile crossing his face. He had made a difference, after all. Eli Munro had changed. The quiet drifter Will had once helped was no longer a man on the run, but a man of influence, of wealth and power. The years had transformed him, but so too had the town of Fort Kavanaugh. The dusty streets that once held the spirit of community now seemed to carry the weight of greed, and Will could feel it in his bones. A familiar unease had settled over the town like a slow-moving storm, and the sheriff, now retired, was all too aware of where the winds were coming from. It had started small, the first whispers of change. A few ranch hands, some hired hands in the field, had appeared here and there, buying up parcels of land from local farmers, paying in cash, and often with more than a fair price. No one thought much of it at first. It was, after all, the natural way of things in the West. Men bought land, men grew wealth, and the town grew alongside them. But as the months passed, Will couldn't ignore the patterns. The local farmers, those who had worked the land for generations, were now feeling the pressure. Some had to sell, and others simply couldn't compete. The once thriving town that had been a beacon of hard work and self-reliance was slowly falling under the weight of Eli's influence. The land that had sustained the community was being traded for promises of prosperity. But Will knew better. He had seen this before, heard the stories in his younger days of men who started with good intentions only to get consumed by their own ambitions. And Eli had become one of them. He had turned into the very thing he had once promised to fight against, the oppressive force in the town, the shadow hanging over every decision, every farmer's hope. The tipping point came one morning as Will walked through the square, his steps slow and deliberate, as they had been in his later years. The vibrant hum of the market, the familiar chatter of neighbors, the smell of fresh bread, had faded. In its place was the dull murmur of those who knew that their livelihoods were no longer in their hands. The faces that greeted Will were strained, their smiles forced, their eyes full of worry. He didn't need anyone to tell him. He could see it in the way the ranch hands spoke, in the way the farmers' shoulders sagged. Eli's men were everywhere now. The ranch had expanded, and with it Eli's grip on the town. It wasn't just the land anymore. It was the very spirit of the place that was being suffocated. Will saw Eli across the square, standing by his men, overseeing the dealings, his posture proud, his face calm. A few ranchers laughed nearby, exchanging stories of the town's fate, as if it were all just business, nothing personal. Eli's smile never wavered, but Will could see something darker behind his eyes now. Where once there had been gratitude, there was now something colder, a hard edge that Will couldn't ignore. Approaching him, Will tried to keep his voice steady, but the weight of the years and his disappointment was clear. "You've done well for yourself, Eli," he said, his tone calm but heavy with unspoken words. But at what cost? Eli turned to him, his expression unreadable. For a moment their eyes met, and the world seemed to pause. The air between them was thick, as though the years had built up an invisible wall. Will had once seen a spark of promise in Eli, a chance for redemption, but now that spark seemed lost, replaced by the cold flicker of ambition. "I've done what needed to be done, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice firm but polite. "You knew this town couldn't stay the way it was. Things change." Will shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Not like this, Eli. You didn't come back just to repay a debt. You came back to take what was never yours." Eli's smile faltered, but only for a second. "I didn't take anything, Sheriff. The people here sold it to me, and I gave them more than they could have asked for, more than you ever did." Will's breath hitched in his chest. More than you ever did. The words stung, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. He had been a protector, a man of the law, but he had never been a businessman. He had never known how to play the game the way Eli had. And now, standing here, he realized that the town, his town, was slipping away. The sense of betrayal was sharp, but deeper still was the realization that it had all been so gradual. At first, it had been the small acts of kindness, the sense of community that had held Fort Kavanaugh together. But over time, those threads had frayed. Now it was nothing more than a town bound by contracts and deals, a place where people were valued only by what they could give. Will had been a part of that too, hadn't he? He'd given mercy where it was needed, but now he couldn't find the line between helping and enabling. "You've forgotten what this town was," Will said, his voice breaking slightly as he gestured to the now empty town square. "It wasn't about the land, Eli. It was about people, about building something together. And now look at it." Eli's eyes darkened, but his voice remained cool. "The world doesn't wait for people to feel things, Sheriff. You should know that by now." And with that, Will understood. Eli hadn't just come to repay a debt. He had come to remake the town in his own image, and in doing so, he had changed it beyond recognition. The town was no longer its own. It was now a reflection of the man who had brought it under his thumb, a man who had once been lost but had risen on the backs of the people who had trusted him. And now, with a single glance, Will could see the truth, that the town was nothing more than a trophy for Eli's ambition. He had been wrong to believe that kindness could hold a town together. The reckoning was here, silent, unspoken, but undeniable. And Will was left standing at the center of it all, watching the town he had once loved slowly fade away. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its golden light over the town, Will could finally rest. He had seen the change in Eli, seen the man take responsibility for the mistakes he had made. They had both found redemption in different ways, Will through his actions, Eli through his understanding. The town of Fort Kavanaugh, though battered by time and ambition, would heal. It wasn't the land that made it special, and it wasn't the cattle or the wealth. It was the people. And in that, Will found the quiet hope that had been missing for so long. They had both found their way, together.